Oh, guys, good, you hear? I am so excited. Guess what? I hope this isn't about your podcast again. Why, did you finally listen to it?
Da-da-da-da, 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 the Gloomy Next Door production. You're listening to BYOTP Radio. Coming up next, the Gloomy Next Door. The Gloomy Next Door podcast.
Dun, 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 dun.
Hi, nice to meet you. I'm everybody's friend.
Hello, Pups and Kittens, and welcome to another fun-filled and international edition of the Grimmer Next Door podcast. I'm your host, Chris Green, and joining us this week to kick off our plant-based diet series is Dr. Sarah Dodd. She's an amazing veterinarian up in Canada, and she will be sharing all of her knowledge with us regarding plant-based diet and being a vegan. Before we actually have her on, and before we even get started, I just want to thank all of the people who were involved in putting up with my insane research when it came to the plant-based diet. One person in particularly was Dr. Lori Koger. She absolutely answered every question at all kinds of times, and I really appreciated her not losing her mind when I would ask stupid questions and trying to really understand the nutrition side to all of this. And being that she is absolutely one of the most brilliant women I know, I really leaned on her a lot. So thank you very much for not losing it with me. And Troy Allison, you also from Fetching Foods have been an absolute best friend when it comes to answering different questions and me kicking ideas around to you. If it wasn't for a lot of the people that were and have been around the podcast, we would probably never be able to do these episodes, because I really do value the friends that we develop over these episodes and over time. All of these people have grown in this podcast as amazing assistants to making us where we are. I couldn't do it without them and without their knowledge and guidance and just sometimes listening to me rant about ideas and kicking them around. So thank you guys for all that you've done and put up with me during this whole process to get this series out there. Well, by that sound, Sarah is about to actually enter the podcast studio. So, with that said, welcome Dr. Sarah Dodd to the podcast.
Attention, passengers. We are now landing in Toronto, Canada, and the time is currently on your watch. Thank you for traveling with us.
All right, this week we are going to be kicking off our plant-based diet series with Dr. Sarah Dodd in Ontario, Canada, which, you know, it's funny. Our very first two guests are in Canada, so welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me, Chris.
It is a pleasure. I am so happy to be able to do this, and I'm so happy that we were able to find some time to actually sit down and have this discussion. Because, you know, for one, you're a great veterinarian. I've actually seen a couple papers you've written over different articles that I saw online, and I was like, oh my gosh, okay. And that was kind of cool. But I liked your passion. You have a passion for your belief, and you want to back it up with science, and I love that. So the first thing I always like to know about everybody is their origin story. So how did you become a vet, and how did you become who you are today?
Well, Chris, you know, I have to admit, my origin story is probably pretty boring. I have a very similar origin story to most veterinarians out there. You know, it's just a casual, when I was a kid, loved animals, grew up, still loved animals, always wanted to be a veterinarian, and, you know, went through the school process, went into vet school, and it's just been a dream ever since, really.
Now, what is it like now? I'm going to assume you went to school in Canada to become a vet. So you actually probably went there. Did not.
I would actually have to. No, I did not. I went to school in New Zealand.
Ah, see, you left that out. That is not boring. Okay, so how did that come about?
I had done my undergraduate degree over in the UK, and I had really enjoyed, I was young, I was not yet scared of debt. I've grown up now, I'm scared of debt, I'm in a lot of debt. But I really enjoyed living abroad, and to be completely honest with you, I loved living in England, and I had planned on going to vet school there and staying there as well. And then, I met my now husband, and he wanted to travel. We were in England. He wanted to leave England. So I thought, well, okay. Well, kind of need an English-speaking veterinary school, not in England, not in Canada, and New Zealand was the one I wound up going to.
That is not boring, even by the slightest. That's completely unique. Okay, so I knew I detected an accent in there, but I was just thinking, okay, well, I wasn't really sure. So I can detect a little bit of a British accent. I'm not really sure if I pick up anything New Zealand, but so you went to school in New Zealand. What was that like? What is veterinary school like there?
Well, I think the biggest difference really is the culture. Mm-hmm. Veterinary schools, they're all, if they're accredited, which Massey University in New Zealand is, accredited with the American Veterinary Medical Association. And so the curricula are all very similar in what they need to cover. So the schooling process itself, I suppose, was probably pretty standard. But what was really different was the culture. Living in New Zealand, the people are so incredibly friendly and so laid back that the lifestyle was it was a very, very relaxed atmosphere. And it was a real joy to be there. And it's there's two main islands. Neither of them are particularly large. When you're Canadian, I suppose when you're a Kiwi, then they're the biggest islands, but as a Canadian, I thought, wow, these islands are so small and you're never really that far from the coast. So where the vet school is located, it's only about 40 minutes from the beach. So took the dogs to the beach very regularly, and it's a pretty good quality of life,
Huh. So, all right, you go to veterinary school, you graduate. What brings you back to Canada?
So by that point, I suppose I'd been away from Canada for about 9 years, and it was really family that brought me back. It's a very long way away when you cross the Pacific Ocean, and being unable to see family members, particularly aging family members, it was time to come back home.
Understandable. But of course, weather is massively different.
Yes, and I brought my dogs with me, of course, from New Zealand, where we adopted them. And they'd never seen snow before until they came to Canada. So that weather was very different for them. And to be honest with you, I really missed the winters. So I'm pretty happy to be home.
Well, yeah, they're probably going, I miss the beach and the always warm weather. But hey, Now, my next favorite thing to always ask is your soapbox moment. Everybody has that moment where they just get on their little soapbox and want to rant about something or preach about something. What gets you on your soapbox?
Well, I think you will be very unsurprised to hear that it's quite pertinent to today's discussion. And what gets me on my soapbox, I suppose, is when people try to tell me that dogs are obligate carnivores. And they are not. They are, in fact, omnivores. Mm-hmm. They are very carnivorous omnivores, and evolutionarily speaking, the predecessor of the dog and even the domestic dog themselves, they evolved eating a diet that was very rich in animal products, absolutely, but it was not exclusively animal products. And so that's my kind of soapbox, is that dogs are not, in fact, obligate carnivores. They are facultative carnivores or omnivores.
Works for me. I will be topicking on that in a little bit, and so, I will kick a couple of thoughts around on omnivores and even go into the cat portion. But, this is always that that part, we all get to know who you are, and it's always the best part. So I'm going to save that one. But biggest challenges. Now, let's first stop on that. You're a vegan, so we want to make sure that that's something that you've been for always. Is it something that you kind of inhabited over time? How did that become a way of life?
Yeah, so that was definitely a progression over time. I was raised vegetarian, and really, I just never questioned that. Really until probably, I would say, halfway through high school, at which point kind of a friend had made some comments, and I really got me thinking, and I thought, I've never really thought about the use of other animals for products that don't seem to be directly related to their slaughter. And so it wasn't really until then that I started to look into it, and I started to question things when I really discovered how uncomfortable I was with the processes that go on for dairy and eggs and other animal byproducts. And it was at that point that I really, I guess I would say, started to go vegan. I certainly started with a fully plant-based diet, but continued, for example, I was really, really big into sports, really into rock climbing and mountaineering, and, I still had leather boots or leather winter gloves and things like that, and so really wouldn't call myself full vegan at that point. I certainly kind of, in my head I thought it was, but it was definitely a progression over time to the point where I am today.
Being vegan is very challenging because there's so many different levels to it. You think about electronics and how there are byproducts in the cords. There's byproducts in building material, in houses, in clothing. I mean, it's kind of weird how, it just depends on how committed you are to it and how high up that level you're going to go. I did a whole episode on it, and I was just amazed on just how much has animal byproducts in everyday electronics and products and everything out there. And do you ever find that to be a little bit of a challenge? Thinking, oh gosh, my TV's plugged in, the cord has some kind of byproduct of some sort. Does that bother you, or have you actually been able to just buy something that actually doesn't have the byproduct in it?
That perspective, actually, absolutely. It is a challenge, and honestly, every day you learn new things that you never would have thought would have animal products in them.
Right.
And so that, I think it comes from a standpoint, and I think, if you look on the website, for example, of the Vegan Society, I don't know their kind of motto verbatim, but it's something along the lines of living a life which excludes the use of animals in as much as is possible. And so living in the modern lifestyle and being, connected with other people and with the work I do, I certainly can't avoid computers or phones.
Right.
And so it's working towards trying to exclude animal products as much as is possible. So, for example, the clothes I wear, I don't wear any wool. I buy clothes from companies which use plant-based dyes or synthetic dyes. So certainly every time I learn of something new, I try to find an alternative source so that I can be as free from animal products as is possible. But absolutely, it is very, very surprising when you look into it just how much has animal products in it. But I wouldn't say that should discourage anyone. If there's anyone who is looking to go vegan or who, is vegetarian or vegan, and it's really about just trying to educate yourself and not be overwhelmed by these things and kind of feel as if there's nothing you can do about it. It's more about trying, and as you discover these things, you go, oh, dang, I didn't know that. Okay, well, moving forward, I'm going to go in this direction instead. And really, really just about learning and progressing. And that's why I say, it's been a lifelong progression for me. And I'm sure there's still things that I'm unaware of that I use. And when I become aware of them, I will do my best to avoid them as well.
It is a lot to go over, and that's why I'm always curious, because again, doing a plant-based diet series, we don't really go into the vegan, life. And, personally, I'm vegetarian, but, I don't know if I will ever make it as far as vegan, but I'm definitely cautious on everything that we buy. I'm definitely cautious on what I eat, and even down to, obviously, what my pets eat. So I definitely can commend you, because it is a lot of work, and it can be very stressful. Now, what is the biggest challenge being a vegan and a veterinarian?
I think that would be you can feel isolated. And I think this is something that, not just as a veterinarian, but I think, I don't know how many of your podcast listeners themselves may be, vegetarian or vegan, but you can feel isolated, certainly, because you're surrounded by all these people who love dogs and cats, right? Mm-hmm. And you kind of, from a vegan perspective, you look at them and you see, but you don't love all animals, and you can feel a bit, you can feel a bit isolated, and you start to wonder, you're like, is there something wrong with me? Yeah. Or, and so I think that's the biggest challenge, and it was certainly a challenge, I would say, with going through school, because you don't get to specialize straight from the get-go, and so you do spend a lot of time on farms, and you spend a lot of time in slaughterhouses and different animal rendering facilities. And that can be really very, very challenging to be around in that environment. And to see other people in that environment as well, I think, is probably the hardest part.
I would imagine. I mean, I couldn't do it. I've always said you need to go into a slaughterhouse. You need to see this firsthand, but I just can't do it. I cannot bring myself to it. It would bother me just to see a cow or a pig or a chicken. It would bother me. I mean, I look at it and go, let's go play, instead of, get in my belly kind of personality. So that would be difficult. And I don't know if I don't think I could do what you do when it comes to actually going to vet school. So I'm going to actually give you the opportunity to choose where we start when it comes to plant-based diet for dogs and cats. Since you're the expert here, where would you like to start in this discussion?
Well, I think probably a good place to start is just with kind of I guess you could call it the question, what is a plant-based diet for dogs? And, can you feed a plant-based diet to dogs? Because I think that's probably the most burning question that anyone would have who's listening. Probably. And so, I mean, looking at plant-based diets, so really what that means is a diet that has been manufactured, whether it's a commercial diet or whether it's a homemade diet. They've either been formulated or manufactured that does not include any animal products. So you could call it, vegan friendly. And so, the listeners will say, but, I'm pretty sure you said that dogs were omnivores. So doesn't that mean that they do need some meat? Because they're not herbivores. And that's absolutely correct. They are not herbivores. But from our current understanding, and I stress current understanding, from our current understanding of the physiology and nutritional requirements of dogs, what they need, and what I'm aware this is your absolute favorite agency, ASCO, what they stipulate is a list of nutrients, not ingredients. And so just like us, dogs need essential nutrients to keep them healthy. And then really the only question becomes, can we provide those nutrients without there being any animal products? And from our current level of understanding, yes, we absolutely can.
Now, one of the things I have noticed is that because we don't have a meat base, there's a lot more carbs in it, and the breakdown of carbohydrates worry me a little bit, because we all know that they're going to break down to a sugar, and cancer loves sugar, and since 1 in 2 dogs actually are getting cancer, is that a concern?
Well, first we'd have to look at, when you say carbs, and we talk about sugars, it's starches that we're referring to. Because carbohydrates also includes fibers, and that's your insoluble and your soluble fibers. And so a lot of the plant-based diets you'll find are actually lower in starch than conventional commercial diets. And by conventional, I mean, like a cooked animal-based diet. And because starches are actually very, very useful in the process of making kibble. It's called extrusion. They help to bind, it's a wet material that goes through the extruder and is cooked at pressure and temperature. And the starches actually help to really bind everything together. When you're looking at a plant-based diet, a lot of the protein sources are coming from beans and legumes. And they're not typically adding in a lot of other starches. So you won't find much in the way of, say, rice or potato, because you already have so many products coming with the legumes and with the beans. And so really, there's probably more fiber and less starch than a conventional kibble. And so if we're talking about that carbohydrate metabolism, you're actually finding that these may have lower starches. And, we've seen that legumes have a lower, if you want to talk about, the sugars and breakdown, glycemic index than more conventional carbohydrates, which are commonly used. And also, regarding the sugars and cancer, we don't have a heck of a lot of research supporting that. We do have a few published papers regarding that, but it hasn't been repeated a lot. And also, if we're concerned about cancer in particular, then we're concerned about a particular animal who already has cancer. So if we're looking at a general population, and if we're just talking, for example, about, healthy adult dogs being fed a maintenance diet, at that point, we're not really considering cancer because there isn't any presence of cancer. But that was just kind of an aside that's not as much to do with plant-based diet.
Well, I'm just enjoying listening. So, you keep going. That's kind of the whole basis of this is to give plant-based diet a voice. And between all of you who are coming on here, that's really what I wanted to. And I wanted to topic generically on a lot of the concerns that are out there. And it doesn't seem to be only a U.S. concern. It's a global concern where a lot of these issues have come up where you've heard it. That's why it's one of these discussions. It's a passionate discussion where it's, well, the only reason why we're going they want to actually have their dogs and cats go vegan is because they're vegan. Or my dog, is fed vegan or plant-based and it does great. And then you'll hear the debunking of it. And, that's where it all comes down to, okay, well, let's hear it from people who, A, feed it, and B, understand the science behind it. So, it's kind of funny because you have that soapbox moment where you're like, I can stand on this soapbox and I can explain plant-based until pretty much the end of the decade. And I'm still probably not going to get through to a lot of people. And I'm sure you get that a lot. But if you get through to one, at least you've made your message come through.
And I think for me, when we're talking about getting through to people, it's really just letting people know the realities of things. And so the realities are, really, is there any other ingredient out there that we would question as much as we question plants? Because, you look at this, if you look at the nutrient profile, and again, I'm going to reference AFCO, I apologize, but it is our industry standard. It's our standards that the entire industry works on, and so that's really kind of what you can put this as a framework around, is that with a plant-based diet,
right,
you can meet all of those requirements, unquestionably. You can meet all of those requirements. It has been done. We have diets that are formulated that are nutritionally complete and balanced according to those requirements. And so really what it comes down to is ingredients, and people get really hung up about the fact that this is a plant-based diet. And what I just kind of want to throw out there as a question is, what if it was a giraffe-based diet? We don't know anything about the nutritional content of giraffe leg. But if I made a diet out of giraffe leg for dogs, would people question it as much as they question the plant-based diet?
Probably
it really
not.
doesn't come down to, yeah, exactly. And so that's what it means. It really doesn't come down to a question of the nutrition, because we know, we have seen, we can formulate diets that are plant-based and meet these nutritional requirements of dogs. What it really comes down to is just this cognitive challenge where people are saying, but there's no animal products in it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's all we really need to get over, is that an adult maintenance diet is an adult maintenance diet, regardless of what ingredients are in it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, look, there's loads of companies out there now that are using all sorts of different animal proteins that we never ever used.
Mm-hmm. Very true.
And nobody's questioning that in terms of nutritional sufficiency. Nobody's questioning what the nutritional content is of all these weird and wonderful animals that are being put into diet. Because we have alligator diets now. Well, it's certainly not natural for a dog to eat an alligator. It would be the other way around in nature.
Right.
Right?
It would definitely be.
And so it's really, people get really hung up on this concept of plant-based solely from an ingredient perspective. And that's really, I think, that the important understanding here is that we don't recognize an importance in ingredients. We recognize an importance in nutrients.
It is a very unique science. That's the one thing I've come to throughout all of this. I always concern mostly over a starch. I do. And that's why I've always got that in the front and in the back of my mind whenever I look at anything. That's my hang up right there. I'm not, again, with my dogs, they have a plant-based in their diet. So, that's there. Now, I wanted to go on something because you've referenced dogs and omnivores. Dogs, have been considered by most as omnivores by science. But in evolution, it's almost as if they've been converted to facultatives. I can never get that word right. I knew I was never going to hit it right. Facultatives.
Yes.
I knew I was going to blunder the word, but I was trying not to. So the question is, now, in the evolution is through everything, because I do believe, they were carnivore, then they went to omnivore, and we've now moved on to the next. Dogs need a plant-based diet in their food, so this does make sense in many ways. And I'd like to hear your opinion to it.
I think that's a really good point that you bring up there regarding the evolution of the dog and how they have changed. And I think earlier in 2016, I believe, there was a paper released, and I believe this is an open access paper. So if you can find a link, I'm sure you can put it in the show notes here for your listeners to access. And it was by a researcher named Axelson. And he actually looked at the genetics of dogs and wolves and could actually pinpoint in evolution where dogs actually started to develop the ability to digest plant material and to digest starches. And that's really where we see it as being kind of a key pinnacle of the domestication of the dog versus, the wild wolf.
Right.
Now, even wolves, they will eat plant material. They are omnivorous. They are carnivorous omnivores, but they will also eat plant material. You won't often find wild cats eating plant material. They do eat the plant material within the digestive tract of their prey, whereas wolves, and very closely related to wolves, are bears, and they eat a very, very rich plant-based diet. Whereas the wolves, they were more of a carnivorous omnivore, And dogs were then, as they evolved, they kind of co-evolved with humans. And through this domestication process, they actually began to rely more and more on humans as a source of food in terms of eating our refuse.
Mm-hmm.
And we're talking refuse as in, not plastic bags and rubbish as we think today. This was thousands of years ago, and we're talking about, people around a fire and, leaving leftovers of food. And I really hate to say it, but human excrement as well, likely a very good source of nutrition for our canine predecessors. And so that was a really good point that you brought up there about that evolution, because they certainly have evolved an ability to utilize plant-based nutrients.
Now, with that said, cats being carnivore, is it possible that because of evolution again, they could have actually now gone into omnivore?
No. Cats are still considered obligate carnivores from a nutritional perspective. And what that really refers to is that they require specific nutrients above and beyond what are essential to, the essential nutrients that dogs and cats both share. Cats do have additional essential nutrients, which are challenging or impossible to obtain from natural plant sources. There are new kind of findings, particularly regarding marine plants, so different micro and macroalgae, which do contain these nutrients that cats require. And sorry, I should take a step back and explain that. What we're talking about particularly is arachidonic acid, which is an essential fatty acid. Vitamin D. Cats do not do as well with vitamin D2 as they do with vitamin D3. Vitamin D3 is animal-derived. Vitamin D2 is plant-derived. Although, again, we don't have a heck of a lot of research into that. Our current thought is that they do better with D3 than with D2. Vitamin A. Dogs are able to convert what are called carotenoids, which are found in, as the name suggests, particularly orange vegetables such as sweet potato or carrot. They can convert that into vitamin A. Cats cannot. Cats are also terrible at elongating particular omega-3 fatty acids into DHA and EPA. And so DHA and EPA are not recognized particularly as essential fatty acids for all life stages by AFCO. But cats are really terrible at elongating fatty acids, and so the EPA and DHA are really quite essential for them as well.
Now,
and so that's where the basis of this obligate carnivore comes from, is that they require these nutrients that traditionally would only be available in animal products.
but then why is it that there are a lot of claims out there that say we can actually do this? We can plant-based diet for cats too.
Yeah, so in the theory, we absolutely can. Because I said there's no real source of these nutrients from a natural plant source, but there is in synthetic. So, for example, taurine is one that gets talked about a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And taurine is a sulfur amino acid. And it is not really found in any real concentrations of any use in plants. However, we have synthetic taurine, and synthetic taurine is added to many, many, even animal-based cat foods.
Mm-hmm.
And some dog foods, many dog foods, in fact. Even though it's not an essential nutrient for dogs, it's beneficial. It spares the precursors, particularly methionine and cysteine, from being used to produce taurine. And so it's added synthetically to many diets. Taurine is quite heat sensitive. So when diets are heat processed, even if there's taurine in the ingredients, if they're meat-based ingredients, particularly heart tissue, it can be denatured during the heat and cooking process. And so there's synthetic taurine added. And this synthetic taurine, we have research that shows that it is just as useful for the body as the naturally derived taurine. And so that can be added to a plant-based diet. And so really, we can formulate a plant-based diet which has all the nutrients for cats.
Okay. It works for me. I mean, the science, like you keep saying, it has not really been able to really fully understand this, then again, we've said this from the beginning of it, this is a passionate conversation where both sides, are saying this works. And, it's the sad part about this conversation is, and I know you've seen it too, is the fact that a lot of different sides have said, no, it's this way, and this is how it is, and we're gonna do it this way, we're gonna believe it this way. And it really doesn't matter which side we're talking about. Both, plant-based and meat-based are all saying the same. But
and you know what? The one thing to take home from that, at least that is a positive message, is that both sides want to do the right thing.
Yes.
It's just that their perspective of right, if you will, is different. So the plant-based feeders, it's really only vegans who feed plant-based. I've never even seen a vegetarian, and the research shows there aren't any vegetarians who feed plant-based to their pets. It's really only vegans who feed strictly plant-based to their pets.
And
these are people who really care about all animals.
And I agree with that.
So you can guarantee that they don't want to do the wrong thing for their cat. Because their cat is an animal, or their dog, their pet is an animal as well.
Right.
And so they don't want to do the wrong thing. But you can also see it from the other perspective. Because there are people, and then there are many veterinarians, and there are, all the veterinary nutritionists that you'll speak to, and they say they want to do the best thing for that individual animal.
Right.
And so at least one thing to take home is that both sides want to do the right thing.
It's just
that we don't have a lot of research which can point towards which right is right. If you get what I mean.
I do, and that brings up that whole question of why hasn't there been more research in this? Why is the science still so limited? Because
this field is in its infancy. We've really only had, for example, commercial plant-based diets available for a couple of decades. So it's really, really new. There's only a handful of companies that are producing plant-based diets. Most of these companies are small, independent companies. We do have plant-based diets, for example, from Royal Canin. Royal Canin have a vegetarian blend. This is a veterinary therapeutic brand, which is held in very high regard amongst most veterinarians and veterinary nutritionists. The one caveat is that the diet contains vitamin D3, not vitamin D2. So it is not strictly plant-based. It is mostly plant-based. Same with, for example, Purina HA. Again, another veterinary therapeutic diet, which most veterinarians and veterinary nutritionists hold in high regard. Again, it has vitamin D3, not D2, but it is otherwise completely plant-based.
It's kind
Other than those, it's really just... Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead. Keep going.
Okay. Other than those, it's really only small, independent companies, and particularly, vegan companies, who got into the business with that, not from being pet nutritionists, but from being vegans who got into pet nutrition because they wanted to make something to be available for other vegans to feed to their pets. And it's very, very expensive to do the research and to do, feeding trials and to be analyzing the diets. And I'm not going to try and use that as an excuse. I think that everybody who's producing commercial diet that's being sold and fed to pets really need to be backing up. It's all well and good to formulate something on the computer, but you really need to be testing those diets and making sure that they actually contain the nutrients at the levels that they are supposed to contain them at. And so the large companies, they can afford to do all that testing and feeding trials and putting more and more research and generating more and more data regarding what's commonly being sold in stores. But because this whole plant-based thing is so small and so new, there's really very, very little money that's been invested in the research. And so it's a bit of a dilemma because it's very, very hard to make any sound recommendations to people without really knowing that the recommendations that you're making are safe. So it's a very challenging field to be in.
You know, I love it. I love the conversation to it, though. That's the thing. I love the fact that there is a possibility of another form of nutrition. I guess that's what really has driven me in this entire process. I mean, you know, you've been around almost since the beginning when I started this concept. I think that we started talking maybe a week or two after the initial idea of doing this series, and we've had multiple conversations about it, and every single time either I talk to you or somebody else regarding this, and again, it could be on both sides. It could be pro-meat, it could be, you know, pro-vegan. It never ceases to amaze me how interested I am in what their opinion is. And I like hearing what you're saying because, you know, I do think that there should be more science to this. There should be more studies. It is kind of, you know, I would say even more new to majority of pet parents. It's almost kind of like it just came out kind of new. For most of us, we didn't know it existed. And that's kind of the interesting part. I would rather see more science done. And that's kind of where I'm at. I'm like, you know, I'm starving for more information. I want to know more. I want to see some more science in it because if you look out there, the stuff you do find, it's the debunking or it's really not entirely accurate or it's put out by a company that is, you know, pro-meat, garbage kibble, trying to scare pet parents. That's the part that worries me. Because if there is a viable source and we can sustain this way, again, it's evolution. We should always be thinking about the technology, and that includes nutrition. So that's where I'm at. Now, I'm curious what you would have. If you have, you know, now the mic is in front of you for you to actually talk to all pet parents, whether they're already vegan, whether they're, you know, thinking about leaving a pet kibble, that one of the big pet companies, or if they're even a biologically appropriate raw feeder and thinking maybe an actual plant-based is a good idea. What would you have to say to them to try to convince them?
Well, before we started recording, as I mentioned, I don't think it's my place to try and convince anyone to feed any particular diet. Where I think my place is just to let people know what the realities are, what the truth is.
Right.
And the truth is, we really only have a handful of studies which have investigated plant-based diets. And what I'll also say is, as I said before, just because it's plant-based, does that mean it has to be scary? What we have is we have a plethora of studies showing, and the entire AFCO regulations developed around these nutrient profiles.
Mm-hmm.
So if we have a diet that is formulated to be nutritionally complete and balanced for a certain life stage, for a certain species, then that diet is just as nutritionally sufficient as any other diet. So that's what I'll say, and I'll leave that up to the listeners, the pet parents, the pet lovers, the animal lovers, to do with what they like with that information. But every diet that is complete and balanced is as nutritionally sufficient as any other in meeting the nutritional requirements of the pet that it was formulated for.
Now,
and so I think...
Go on.
Okay. And so I think what it comes down to really is, you know, why would somebody choose to feed any one diet over another? Why would you choose to feed plant-based over not plant-based? And so what it comes down to really is a matter of concern. So if people have concerns about sustainability, if people have concerns about the environment, if people have concerns about the well-being of all the other animals that are put into the diets that are fed to cats and dogs, then that's really something that they should take into consideration. For example, just last year, there was a report that was published by Gregory Oken. I hope I pronounced his name correctly. And again, I believe this is an open access journal. It's published in PLOS ONE, so I think everybody should be able to see it. And what he breaks down is, particularly in the U.S., what the impact is of feeding cats and dogs in terms of sustainability. And it's actually quite frightening how he breaks it down. And at the end, his conclusion is actually maybe that we should reduce the rate of cats and dogs that we keep in favor of other pets who don't eat meat because of the sustainability impact. But being a veterinarian and having been involved in shelter medicine before as well, I've seen so many healthy dogs and cats be euthanized because there's no home for them.
Right.
And again, even looking in the USA alone, we're losing millions of cats and dogs that are being euthanized just because there isn't a home for them. So I think saying, no, we can't keep cats and dogs because this is not nutritionally sustainable, that's just going to wind up in the death of more pets.
Right.
So instead, what we need to look at is, if we can't sustainably keep meat-eating cats and dogs, then instead of cutting the cats and dogs part out, what if we cut the meat-eating part out? And so if we can, and that's a big if because, as I said before, we can. So if we can keep dogs on a plant-based diet, why wouldn't we?
All right. I'm not going to argue it in any way because, again, it's a very sound argument, and I always look at everything and go, there is always a possibility. Now, one thing about this podcast that always interests me is knowing that we have different veterinarians from all over who listen as well. And in this kind of context, we get the opportunity to have an expert. And I had this with our other couple interviews that are coming in, that I wanted them to actually talk to the veterinarians now and give them the message of, sway them, if you possibly can, to why this is a viable source for nutrition.
Okay, so again, for me, that would really come down to the science aspect. And the handful of studies that we have out there, which have looked at either the nutritional content of plant-based diets or the effects on animals that are being fed plant-based diets, we haven't found anything strongly negative. So there was a study done by Brown and colleagues in 2009 that even used racing sled dogs. And racing sled dogs have a much higher nutritional requirement than your average day-to-day pet dog. And they were fed an experimental plant-based diet, and they competed, they continued training, they had no negative health effects, and the blood parameters which were analyzed, they were all normal. And so that study determines that, well, it can be sufficient, it can be nutritionally sufficient for these very high-energy, high-output dogs. We have a couple of studies that have looked at the actual nutritional components, and have also looked at dogs that are being fed those, and they looked at different, again, health parameters, physical exam, they took some blood parameters, and the study that I'm alluding to right now was done by, and again, I apologize if I pronounce her name wrong, but by Semp over at the University of Vienna. And it didn't find that there were any abnormalities. And so bringing it back again, it's just that if we're feeding a diet that fits the nutritional profile required by dogs, it really doesn't matter where those nutrients come from. It just matters that the nutrients are there, and they're there in the right levels for the life stage of that animal and the species. And so we don't really have much that points a finger at plant-based diets and says, no, these are not suitable. We don't have a lot of research, but the research that we do have, it all really looks okay. So we don't have any strong evidence of any negative effects. We have some evidence that it is completely nutritionally sufficient, and then we also have the arguments on the side of animal well-being in terms of not being slaughtered and put into cat and dog food. We have the argument of environmental sustainability. And so there's really not a lot to say that this isn't a good idea to move forward with.
All right. Now, dry kibble. You've heard a couple of my episodes. You know how I'm just not a fan of it. Just for the simple fact that we have so many issues when it comes to the health of dogs and especially cats with dehydration and renal failure, UTIs. It just goes on and on and on. What can be done to reduce these risks in dry kibble?
Well, I will have to say that I'm not sure that I appreciate quite the same risks with dry kibble, particularly for dogs. I think for cats, there is an argument for including at least a component of a wet diet for them. Again, evolutionarily speaking, cats are obligate carnivores, and they source their moisture from their prey. They're not particularly good at drinking. They don't get that thirst cue very well. And so for them, I think it is really very important to be including at least a component of their diet as wet food. For dogs, I don't think we appreciate quite the same risks that we do for cats in terms of dry kibble. However, there is really an easy option, is that if you soak kibble, it acts like a sponge, and it essentially just turns that dry kibble into a wet food. And there you have it. You have a wet diet there.
But most of the people,
it's convenient.
Most people are looking to quick and easy, and it's not a location thing. It's really just a global issue. Whatever's quick and easy, kibble is easy, and that's the problem. It's like if you soak kibble, it's gonna, even if you put it in there for a half an hour. And that means that the person has to then come back and then put the bowl down. They want a grab and go kind of moment. And that's the part that scares me, is that, well, we can do better, can't we? Or is this really where the science is kind of stopped for any kind of nutrition? It has to always be in a kibble form. Can't we have something a little bit more sustainable? So a little bit more, workable?
Yeah, and I can completely understand where you're coming from there. Kibble was manufactured and mass-produced because it is convenient. That's exactly where it came from. It's very nutritionally dense, and so it's also very cost-effective because you can provide, and I'm sure if you look at the nutrient density of kibble, and if you've experienced feeding kibble to pets yourself, you'll see, you can get away with really a very small volume to meet the energy and nutrient requirements of the pets. And so that's why kibble has become so popular. It's convenient and it's cost effective. And so a lot of our veterinary research, we use kibbles. And so I think we don't really appreciate risks associated with kibble because that's what we're always using, right?
Right.
And so I can understand where you're coming from with that. It's certainly, if you want to, air quotes, kind of natural. It doesn't fit within that framework, right? And so it does come down to that. So the other option is the canned foods. So canned foods are much less nutrient dense because they contain water, of course. And so you do have to feed a greater volume. And this is, again, it doesn't matter whether you're looking at animal-based or plant-based here. They're really similar in terms of water content and nutrient content. And so you need to feed a greater volume. And I think that it depends really for the individual pet parents how much time they're willing to invest, and really how important to them is the convenience value or the economical value of pet foods. I can really understand where people are coming from when they want to do like a homemade diet, like the Whole Foods or anything like that. I really understand where people come from with that. And if I'm completely honest, I think that if I could dedicate the time to doing that correctly for my dogs, I think I would enjoy doing that for my dogs. But I don't. And my dogs eat kibble because it is easy, it is convenient, and it is cost effective. And I hate to say that, that's really how I make that determination for my own, my fur kids. But I do, and I feel safe in the knowledge that I'm not doing them any harm that way. They do eat a plant-based kibble, and I feel safe in the knowledge that I'm not doing them any harm. From maybe an enrichment perspective, from a bonding perspective, I think people really get a lot out of doing, home-prepared meals. But there are very, very real risks associated with that. And one of the really big risks associated with doing the home-prepared meals is that they're not nutritionally complete and balanced. So when you buy a commercial diet, either a kibble diet or a canned diet in the store, or order online, if you're going to one of the vegan specialty companies and getting a plant-based diet online, you read that statement where it says, formulated to meet the nutritional requirements, or even has undergone feeding trial and proving sufficient to meet the requirements. But when you're doing a homemade diet, you don't have that certainty, and so you really need to make sure that you have a pet nutritionist or a veterinarian nutritionist if the animal isn't healthy, to be on board and to have developed a recipe that is definitely going to be safe for that pet. But I completely understand where people are coming from when that's the direction they want to go. And thankfully, there are canned options out there. And I'm not sure about the States. I know in Canada, there has been one company who were doing, unfortunately, very limited local distribution, but they were doing, I don't really know how to say it because it's a commercial diet. I mean, they're making it and they're selling it, but it's not kibble or canned. It's like a fresh type meal.
Okay.
That were being regionally distributed. But of course, those certainly pose their own challenges in terms of distribution. I mean, if you have a fresh food, how are you going to get that from the commercial kitchen to the pet parent? And so that comes with its whole own set of risks and challenges as well.
I mean, I've seen different companies, and they pack it with ice bags in a really nice container, and it stays cold. So it does work, but then again, it's all up to who's making it, I guess, is the best way.
Absolutely.
There's definitely some commercial kitchens out there that I would definitely avoid. I've always not always. I have one here in the States that I always mention, which is Fetching Foods, and I've seen their work, and it's amazing, and that's why I always support it. And of course, there's other companies that do have good meals, and I personally like that option more because at least it's a fresh food and it's human grade, and that there's not this rendering that's going to go into it, or this just fear of these little kibbles that you just don't really know what's in it. So that's where I always draw into it.
Well, there you go. There's one benefit of plant-based.
Yeah.
There's definitely no rendered ingredients going into any of it.
And see, that's always been that was always a concern when I started this. Is again, it has chicken, it has this, all these different things that you would see in a regular on a bag of meat-based kibble, and yet that was rendered, or it was slaughterhouse waste. I mean, it wasn't even fit for the dump, and yet it's thrown into dog food. And that's always a concern is, okay, plant-based diet, I'm always worried, did they render anything? Because, again, it's always a fear. If you can't see it, how do you know? Yeah, that's always me.
Well, yeah, to be completely honest, I mean, that would come down to familiarity with the companies.
Right.
And really just transparency and companies revealing, and being very upfront about the ingredients that they use in the facilities that things are manufactured in. I think the only really incriminating paper regarding plant-based diets was one that came from UC Davis, and it showed that, lo and behold, a number of plant-based diets that they tested actually yielded mammalian or avian DNA. And so that it's likely that these diets were manufactured in the same facility that a non-plant-based diet was manufactured in. And so when you're looking for DNA, especially if you're using the PCR technique, you only need a very minuscule amount. And so it can detect even just contamination that was left over, even with the cleaning in between lines being run.
Right.
So, yeah, commercial contamination is always a risk. And I mean, that's, like if you're looking at hypersensitivity, in dogs, you have all these diets out there on the market that are just, they've got these crazy concoctions and ingredients in them, kangaroo and potato or something. But if they're produced on a commercial line, then you still have that contamination risk.
True.
So unfortunately, there's certainly that aspect, but with a plant-based diet, if it doesn't contain any animal-derived ingredients, that risk of contamination would be absolutely minimal, and it would really be no different than, eating a human, processed product that's produced, when you see the labels that say produced in the facility, may have come in contact with peanuts or tree nuts. And it's not that the product has those things in them, and the amount of contamination would be absolutely minuscule. But, of course, because it's in the same facility, there is a very, very small risk of contamination. And depending on how sensitive the person is, they can have a reaction. But if you're thinking about particular ingredients of concern, with a plant-based diet at least, those ingredients are not included in the diet.
Gotcha. What didn't we cover in our discussion about plant-based that really needed to be covered?
I can't really think of anything we haven't covered.
That's always the answer I'm always hoping for. I want to make sure that we were able to cover this topic as thoroughly as possible. And, again, this is something you're passionate about, so I want to make sure that as we wrap up, we don't leave anything behind so that you don't feel like, oh, well, we should have covered that. So that's why I always want to make sure, did we cover everything that you really feel is the appropriate way of putting plant-based in a positive light?
Well, I think just to reiterate would be, the scrutiny that plant-based diets come under, I think, is because there's very few that are being commercially produced. Yeah. And again, it's this cognitive leap, this thought of, but it's plant-based. And, as I said before, there's no other ingredient. Nobody blinks when you say an alligator-based diet. So when it comes to ingredients, the fact that they're plants, that really shouldn't concern people. What should concern people is nutrients. Mm-hmm. And when you look at that nutrient profile and you say, yes, that does meet all the requirements, there you go. That's the take-home message, is that we absolutely can formulate, and we do have commercially available, and you can do home formulations of plant-based diets, which absolutely do meet the nutritional requirements of dogs. Unquestionable.
Well, that's good enough for me. I mean, again, I want to make sure that we do our best to kind of have this conversation, and everybody involved can say, you know what, I got my point across and I'm happy with it. So thank you, Dr. Dodd, for being on the podcast. I appreciate you being here. It has been an absolute pleasure. Any last words before we sign off?
I'd just like to thank you for giving me this opportunity. It's been a very, very interesting discussion.
It has been a pleasure. Well, this is Chris Green. Have a pet-tastic week. Bye-bye, everybody.
Okay, gotta go. It's my bedtime.